The river was screaming. Not with water, with ice. Somewhere beneath the frozen crust of the Rhine, the current still moved, grinding against itself in the dark, and if you stood close enough on that last night of the year 406, you could hear it. A low groan, like something enormous, buried alive, trying to remember how to breathe. The soldiers on the far bank heard it too. They had heard it for weeks. A Roman watchman, wrapped in a cloak stiff with frost, pressed his palm against the ice and felt it vibrate. He did not know the word for what was coming. No one did yet. He only knew that the cold this year was wrong. Deeper, older, hungrier than any winter he could remember, and that on the other side of that frozen river, tens of thousands of people were waiting for the ice to hold. It held. On the last night of 406, an entire world crossed a river without ships. Vandals, Suebi, Alans, whole nations, walking on water that should have swallowed them, dragging carts, children, the bones of their ancestors wrapped in cloth. Behind them, a homeland collapsing under a horror they could not fight, a people called the Huns, closing in from the east like a fire with no edges. Ahead of them, an empire that still believed, on that frozen night, that it would last forever. It would not survive the decade. This is the story of the last winter before the lights of the ancient world went out, a winter that did not announce itself with trumpets or omens, but with silence and ice and the quiet arithmetic of a frontier that had finally run out of soldiers. By the time anyone understood what had happened, it was already too late to stop it. It always is. To understand why a frozen river could end a civilization, you first have to understand what that civilization believed about itself. Rome, in the last years of the 4th century, was not a city. It was an idea wearing the skin of an empire, a 1,000-year-old promise that order was permanent, that the legions would always hold the line, that somewhere beyond the frontier the barbarians howled in the dark, but never, ever came inside. Marble forums, aqueducts humming with water stolen from 100 conquered rivers. Senators in wool dyed the color of dried blood, debating grain prices while, 3,000 miles away, entire peoples were being pushed off the map. The empire had split itself in two by then. East and west, two courts, two emperors, one dying faster than the other, and the western half, the older half, the half that still remembered Caesar and Augustus and the myth of Roman invincibility, was rotting from the inside while insisting, loudly, publicly, endlessly, that it was eternal. Its borders were rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, thin blue lines on a map, patrolled by soldiers who were increasingly not Roman at all, Germanic mercenaries in Roman armor, fighting for a state that despised them even as it depended on them entirely. Smell the empire in its final decades, and you smell contradiction. Incense in the temples, and behind it, the iron tang of a treasury bleeding out. Perfume in the imperial court at Ravenna, and underneath it, the sweat and leather stink of frontier garrisons that hadn't been paid in a year. The city of Rome itself, the symbolic heart of it all, had not even been the capital for a generation. The real seat of Western power had retreated behind the marshes of Ravenna, safe, its emperor a boy king more concerned with raising chickens than raising armies. His name was Honorius. He was 11 years old when he inherited the fate of the West. He was 22 when it began to die around him, and he barely noticed. That is not an exaggeration for effect. That is history. And history, as you are about to see, rarely announces its turning points with the drama they deserve. Somewhere on the eastern edge of the world Rome believed it controlled, a boy was growing up who did not yet know he would become the reason an empire remembered its own mortality. His name was Alaric. Born among the Goths, a Germanic people who had already, decades earlier, been permitted to cross into Roman territory as refugees fleeing a catastrophe of their own, Alaric grew up inside a contradiction that would define his entire life. He was Roman enough to serve in Roman armies, to speak the language of command, to understand the empire's laws better than most Romans did. And he was Gothic enough to never, not once, be allowed to forget that he was not truly welcome inside the thing he was fighting to protect. That contradiction would eventually break the world. The Goths who crossed into the empire in 376 had done so not as invaders, but as the desperate, pushed from their ancestral lands by the same terror now driving others across the frozen Rhine. The Huns, a nomadic power whose name alone was enough to empty villages. They had begged Rome for shelter. Rome granted it. And then Rome did what empires under strain so often do to the desperate people they claimed to protect. It starved them. Roman officials on the frontier, tasked with feeding and resettling tens of thousands of Gothic refugees, chose instead to profit from their misery, selling grain at impossible prices, trading food for children who were sold into slavery, watching whole families die of hunger inside the borders of the empire that had promised them safety. The Goths did not forgive this. They rose in rebellion. And in the year 378, at a place called Adrianople, they did something almost no one thought possible. They destroyed a Roman field army. They killed a Roman emperor on the battlefield. The historian who recorded it called it a disaster unmatched since the ancient defeats of the early Republic. He was not exaggerating. 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army lay dead in the dust outside Adrianople, and the Emperor Valens, his body never recovered, some said burned alive in a farmhouse he'd fled to for shelter, became a ghost story the empire told itself in the dark. Alaric was a child when Adrianople happened, but he grew up in its shadow, in a generation of Goths who had learned a lesson Rome desperately hoped they would forget. The empire could bleed. By the time Alaric came of age, he had risen through Roman military service the way ambitious young men, without noble Roman blood, always had to, proving himself in someone else's war, fighting for an empire that used his people as auxiliary shields and called it an honor. He wanted more. When he was passed over for a Roman military command he believed he had earned, something in him hardened into resolve. If Rome would not give him a place inside its system, he would build his own power outside it, and force the empire to reckon with him whether it wanted to or not. He raised an army, not of conquest, not at first, but of demand. Pay us, feed us, recognize us, give my people land, give my people status, give my people the dignity this empire has always promised and never delivered. Rome's answer, again and again, across 2 decades, was delay, bribery, broken treaties, court intrigue, promises made by one Roman general and shattered by the next. Alaric learned patience the way soldiers learn scars, through repetition, through pain, through a decade of being almost satisfied and then betrayed. He would not stay patient forever. And when his patience finally broke, it would not break quietly. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the machine that was supposed to prevent it, a system already grinding itself apart from the inside, long before a single barbarian sword was drawn. The late Roman military was not the legion of Julius Caesar's era. It was a patchwork empire of foreign soldiers, commanded by foreign generals, loyal not to Rome the idea, but to whichever paymaster kept them fed. The most powerful man in the Western Empire during these years was not the Emperor Honorius at all. It was his general, a half-Vandal warlord named Stilicho, who had married into the imperial family and effectively ruled the West from behind the throne of a boy he had been entrusted to protect. Stilicho was, in many ways, the last competent defender the West would ever have. Brilliant, ruthless, utterly devoted to holding the empire together with whatever men, money, and diplomacy he could scrape from a treasury already bled dry. He was also, to the Roman aristocracy who still whispered about bloodlines and purity in their marble dining rooms, always a foreigner, a barbarian in Roman dress, trusted with the empire's survival and despised for his blood in the same breath. This was the poison at the center of the machine. Rome no longer had the manpower to defend its own borders with Roman soldiers alone. It needed men like Stilicho. It needed Gothic and Vandal and Frankish soldiers filling the ranks of its legions. And yet the culture at the top of the empire, the senators, the court, the old families, could not stop treating those same soldiers as lesser, as temporary, as tools to be discarded the moment they became inconvenient. The bureaucracy that ran this system was its own kind of horror. Taxation crushed small farmers into serfdom. Provincial governors bought their offices and recouped the cost through extortion. The great estates of the wealthy grew larger every year, swallowing the free peasantry who had once formed the backbone of Roman society, turning citizens into something closer to bound labor on land they no longer owned. An empire that treats its own people as resources to be extracted rarely notices when it starts treating its defenders the same way. Religion, too, had become a battlefield. The old gods were dying, Christianity was rising, and in the transition, the empire spent enormous energy on doctrinal wars, heresy trials, church councils, theological purges, even as its actual borders stood undefended. Picture it. Bishops arguing over the nature of Christ in warm candlelit halls while, on the frozen edges of the map, entire peoples starved in the snow, waiting for an empire too distracted by its own internal wars to notice the storm gathering beyond its gates. Then came the Huns. No one in the Roman world fully understood what they were dealing with. Reports described a people who lived on horseback, who scarred their children's faces at birth, who moved faster and struck harder than anything the settled world had ever faced. Whatever the truth beneath the rumors, the effect was undeniable. The Huns' expansion into Europe triggered a chain reaction of displaced peoples, each one pushing into the next, until the pressure reached the Roman frontier itself. The Rhine and Danube were never meant to hold back a continent in motion. They held for a while. Then, on the last night of 406, they did not. And the machine that was supposed to protect an empire discovered, in the worst possible moment, exactly how broken it had become. The crossing of the frozen Rhine was not a single battle. It was the opening of a wound that would not close. Vandals, Suebi, and Alans poured into Roman Gaul in numbers the depleted frontier garrisons could not begin to contain. Cities that had stood for 4 centuries under the Roman peace watched their walls breached by peoples who had nothing left to lose. Trier, Mainz, Reims. The province of Gaul, once the beating agricultural heart of the Western Empire, became a landscape of burned granaries and empty roads. A bishop writing from the region described farmland gone silent, villages emptied, the roads littered with the unburied. Whether every detail of these accounts was precise or embellished by grief, the pattern beneath them was real. An entire province had been abandoned to its fate by an empire that no longer had the soldiers to defend it. And Rome's response revealed everything about the empire it had become. Stilicho, desperate to hold the Italian heartland and protect the boy Emperor Honorius, made a fateful choice. He pulled troops away from the Rhine frontier to shore up Italy's own defenses, leaving Gaul to fend for itself against the tide already pouring across the ice. The frontier that had held for centuries had been sacrificed to save the center. It would not be the last time. Meanwhile, Alaric's Goths, still waiting for the recognition and payment Rome had promised and withheld for years, watched the empire's attention consumed by crisis after crisis, and understood, with cold clarity, that the moment for demands had passed. The moment for action had arrived. In 408, everything changed. Stilicho, the one man who had, for over a decade, held the crumbling western defenses together through sheer force of will, was arrested on the orders of the emperor he had served his entire life. Rivals at court had convinced Honorius that his own general was plotting against him, planning to place his son on the throne, conspiring with the very barbarians he had spent years fighting. It was almost certainly a lie. It did not matter. Stilicho was executed. His family was hunted down. And in the purge that followed, Roman soldiers turned on the families of the foreign auxiliaries who had served alongside Stilicho for years, massacring Gothic wives and children in the very cities they had sworn to protect. Tens of thousands of Gothic soldiers, suddenly widowed, suddenly orphaned, suddenly reminded in the most brutal way possible that Rome would never fully consider them human, did the only thing left to them. They marched south. They joined Alaric. The man who had spent 20 years asking Rome, politely, desperately, furiously, for a place inside the empire now had an army built from the empire's own betrayal. He turned that army toward Rome itself. In 408, he besieged the city for the first time, not to destroy it, but to force it to finally negotiate. The Senate paid him off in gold, silver, silk, and pepper, a ransom so vast it emptied the city's treasury. Alaric withdrew. Honorius, safe behind the marshes of Ravenna, refused to honor the settlement his own Senate had negotiated. Alaric returned in 409. He tried, one final time, to work within the system, proposing a Gothic settlement inside imperial territory, formal recognition, a place at the table. Honorius refused again. There is a particular kind of horror in watching a catastrophe that could have been prevented by a single reasonable decision. Alaric did not want to destroy Rome. He wanted, for 2 decades, what he had always wanted: a home, a title, a place inside the world that had shaped him. Rome's answer, over and over, delivered by a boy emperor more interested in his poultry than his empire, was no. But that was not the worst part. The worst part came in August of 410. On the night of the 24th, whether through betrayal from within or exhaustion from without, the gates of Rome were opened. For the first time in nearly 800 years, an enemy army walked into the city that had once conquered the known world. Alaric's men moved through Rome for 3 days. Ancient accounts describe fires along the Forum, treasures stripped from temples that had stood since the Republic, the terror of a population that had been told, for 8 centuries, that this could never happen to them. And yet, and this detail matters, because it reveals something true about the man at the center of the storm, Alaric ordered his soldiers to spare those who took shelter in Christian churches. He was not a monster indulging in annihilation. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life trying to be let inside the empire he was now forced to burn. The eternal city had fallen to a man who had once only wanted to belong to it. News of the sack reached the eastern reaches of the empire, and even beyond, as far as a scholar in North Africa who would soon begin writing one of the most influential books of the age, wrestling with a single unbearable question. If Rome, eternal Rome, could fall, what in this world could be trusted to last? The empire survived the sack of Rome. The illusion of the empire did not. There is a strange, brief moment in every collapse where the structure still looks whole from a distance, where the towers still stand, the ceremonies still happen, the coins still bear the emperor's face, even as the foundation has already crumbled beneath it. The Western Empire, in the years immediately after 410, lived inside that illusion. Honorius still ruled from Ravenna, still issued laws, still received ambassadors in a court dripping with the trappings of imperial majesty, silk, gold, incense, the elaborate rituals of a power that no longer matched the reality outside its walls. Provinces still paid taxes when they could be collected. Armies still marched when soldiers could be found to fill them. The machinery of empire kept turning, powered less by strength now than by momentum, and by the sheer human refusal to believe that something so vast and so old could truly be ending. This was, in its own way, the peak, not of strength, but of appearance. The last generation to grow up believing, however desperately, that Rome would endure. Alaric himself did not live to see how the story ended. He died later in 410, only months after the sack, of a sudden fever, somewhere in southern Italy. His followers, according to later legend, diverted an entire river to bury him in its bed along with a portion of the treasure taken from Rome, then killed the slaves who had done the digging, so that no living person would ever know where the conqueror of Rome had been laid to rest. Whether every detail of that story is true or myth grown from grief, the impulse behind it is unmistakable. Even in death, his people wanted him hidden from an empire they still, somehow, feared might come looking for revenge. It never did. It no longer had the strength. What the sack of Rome revealed, more than any military weakness, was a moral exhaustion that had been building for generations. The Roman aristocracy, even after 410, continued living in extraordinary luxury while provinces burned. Villas across Italy and Gaul grew more opulent even as the tax base supporting the empire's soldiers collapsed. The wealthy had long since learned to shelter their fortunes from the state, to buy exemptions, to let the burden of imperial defense fall on smaller and smaller shoulders. Paranoia became the governing emotion of the imperial court. After Stilicho's execution, no general who served the West again would ever be fully trusted. Every capable commander became, in the eyes of a fearful court, a potential usurper waiting for his moment. The empire began devouring its own most talented defenders out of a suspicion that had, tragically, been earned by decades of betrayal on both sides. This was the hidden cost of empire in its final century. Not merely military defeat, but a civilization that had grown so afraid of its own soldiers, so contemptuous of its own subjects, so devoted to preserving the wealth of the few, that it lost the capacity to defend the many. Honorius himself became almost a symbol of this rot, a ruler famous, in one enduring anecdote, for reacting with greater horror to the reported death of a favorite chicken than to the news that Rome itself had fallen. Historians still debate how literally to take that story, but its survival across the centuries tells you something about how his contemporaries understood him. A man positioned at the exact center of catastrophe, curiously untouched by it. Insulated by marsh and marble from a collapse he seemed barely able to perceive. Loneliness, too, haunted the court at Ravenna. Honorius outlived his wife, outlived his most trusted general, outlived the illusion of stability his own father had left him, and ruled, in his final years, over a shrinking territory from behind ever thicker walls, increasingly disconnected from the empire that still, nominally, bore his name. Power, at the end, often looks less like triumph and more like isolation. The West was learning that lesson in real time. The decades after Alaric's death did not bring recovery. They brought a slow, grinding disintegration that no single battle could reverse. Britain was effectively abandoned by Roman authority around 410, its garrisons withdrawn to defend a crumbling continental core, its cities left to fend for themselves against raiders from the sea. Spain fractured under the weight of the same peoples who had crossed the frozen Rhine decades earlier, carving out kingdoms of their own from what had once been unbroken Roman provinces. Gaul, ravaged repeatedly, became a patchwork of Roman remnants and Germanic settlements, the line between conqueror and citizen growing blurrier with every passing year. A new and terrible name entered the story in the 440s, Attila, leader of the Huns, whose armies swept across the Danube and into the heart of Roman territory with a violence that made even Alaric's siege of Rome look almost restrained. Attila was eventually turned back, in one of the last great combined efforts of Roman and Gothic forces fighting side by side. The same peoples who had once been enemies, now allied out of pure necessity against an even greater terror. It was, perhaps, the final proof of what Rome could have been all along, had it chosen partnership over contempt decades earlier. It came too late to save the West. By the 450s, the Western imperial throne had become a revolving door of puppet emperors, propped up and discarded by whichever barbarian general held the real military power behind them. Rome itself was sacked again in 455, this time by the Vandals, a plundering so thorough that their name would echo for 15 centuries afterward as a synonym for wanton destruction. The empire that had once ruled from the fog-bound hills of Britain to the deserts of Syria had, within 2 generations of that frozen night on the Rhine, been reduced to a fading claim over a handful of Italian provinces. Then, in 476, the final piece fell. A Germanic military commander named Odoacer, commanding an army of federati soldiers who had grown tired of serving a Roman state that could no longer pay or feed them, marched on Ravenna and deposed the reigning Western emperor, a boy, barely a teenager, who bore, in one of history's darker ironies, the name Romulus Augustulus. Little Romulus, a child king carrying the names of Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor, ending the line both men had begun. Odoacer did not kill him. He simply set him aside, pensioned off to a villa in southern Italy, the empire's final ruler quietly disappearing from the historical record, not with a battle, not with a martyrdom, but with the quiet administrative shrug of a system that had simply stopped functioning. No grand final battle, no last stand at the gates, just paperwork and silence, and an empire that had been dying for so long that its actual death barely made a sound. The Senate sent the imperial regalia east, to Constantinople, with a message that the West no longer required an emperor of its own. Rome, the Rome of legend, of legions, of 1,000 years of unbroken rule, had ended not with the roar of conquest, but with the quiet exhale of an old man finally allowed to stop breathing. What happened to the boy who had been the last emperor of the West remains one of history's genuine mysteries. Romulus Augustulus vanishes almost entirely from the record after his deposition. A handful of sources suggest he lived on for years, even decades, in comfortable obscurity, perhaps even receiving a modest pension from the very man who had ended his reign. Others simply lose track of him entirely, his fate swallowed by the same silence that swallowed so much else in those final years. There is something almost unbearable in that ambiguity. An empire that had shaped the known world for 1,000 years, and its final ruler simply disappears. No tomb built for the ages, no monument, no certainty, even, of the year he died. Perhaps that is fitting. The empire itself did not die in a single knowable moment either. There was no battle called the Fall of Rome. No morning when historians could point and say, "Here, this is where it ended." It had been ending for decades, in a frozen river crossed on New Year's Eve, in a general executed on false charges, in a city gate opened after 8 centuries of certainty, in a boy emperor more concerned with chickens than legions, in taxes that crushed farmers and treasuries that could no longer pay soldiers who had once been promised everything and given nothing. The empire survived on paper for a little while longer. The idea of it had already died. Somewhere in southern Italy, an old man who had once worn the purple of Rome's emperors may have lived out his final years in obscurity, tending a garden, watching the seasons change, utterly unaware, or perhaps painfully aware, that he had been the last person in history to hold a title that had shaped the known world for 1,000 years. We will likely never know which. Return, for a moment, to the ice. To that frozen night in 406, when a river that should have been an impassable barrier became, instead, a doorway. Historians still argue over how much of what followed was inevitable, and how much might have gone differently. A wiser emperor, a general spared, a treaty honored instead of broken. Empires are not destroyed by single decisions. They are eroded by thousands of them, made by frightened, ambitious, ordinary people who rarely understand, in the moment, that they are standing at the hinge of history. Rome did not fall because barbarians were strong. Rome fell because an empire built on conquest never learned how to share what it had conquered, because it treated the desperate as disposable, its defenders as foreigners, its own citizens as resources to be taxed into ruin, and its most loyal general as a traitor the moment loyalty became inconvenient. The frost that sealed the Rhine that winter did not create the crisis. It only revealed how little was left standing behind the empire's frontier, how thin the ice already was, long before anyone dared to walk across it. Every civilization believes, in its final glittering decades, that it is different, that its walls are higher, its gods more favored, its history too vast to end. Rome believed this for 1,000 years, and for most of those years, it was nearly right. And then it wasn't. Somewhere tonight, in the quiet hours before dawn, ice is forming on a river you have never heard of, in a place no headline has mentioned, along a border someone, somewhere, has stopped watching closely enough. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it remembers how to freeze. And it remembers, far better than we do, how quietly the last winter always arrives, not as an ending anyone recognizes in the moment, but as a Tuesday. An ordinary, forgettable Tuesday, mistaken for just another cold season in a world that still, right up until the very end, believed it would always be there tomorrow.